I'm Sharon Bill. Welcome to my Music Theory Tuition series where I work with you step by step through the ABRSM Discovering Music Theory grades. I'll work through every single exercise and explain everything you need to know. You can access information about the books I have available to help you on my website. Go to sharonbill.com. For advert-free and longer lessons, you can become a patron at patreon.com/SharonBill. If you can give me a like, that would be super, and please do subscribe to my channel to stay updated. You can support this channel by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/SharonBill. In this section, in chapter 7 on page 61 of grade 5 Discovering Music Theory, we now move on to some more practical applications of music theory, and at the moment we're looking at the instruments of the orchestra. And if you just refer to page 61, we have this diagram showing how the orchestra is laid out. And so we see that we have strings at the front, woodwind, brass, and then percussion at the back. And I really do recommend that you just perhaps do search out some videos and watch some orchestras. And if you can see one live, well, even better. And you'll notice that this is where the conductor stands. And I always think the conductor's got such a tough job because he is keeping, or she is keeping everybody together. And so they are beating the time of the piece, and they have everybody's instrument part in front of them. They can see exactly the music that everybody is playing in the whole orchestra, and they sort of direct the different instrument groups to come in when it's their time to play. And it's really interesting, just while we take a moment about thinking about the orchestra and how orchestras work, before we then sort of dive into the individual instruments. A conductor will always beat time, and depending upon how many beats are in a bar, the conductor will conduct in a certain way. And so the first beat of every bar is always the downbeat of the baton, so we'll be sort of directing a downbeat, and that's because the first beat in every piece of music naturally is more accented. And so if you think you've got the 1, 2, 3, 1, or 1, 2, 1, and so he is telling the whole orchestra where beat 1 falls, and then the final beat of the bar is always going to be the upbeat, the final beat leading ready to the new bar, downbeat. And so this poor conductor has got such a job on his hands. I think the other person that I feel most for in the orchestra is the percussion section, because usually there's an array of percussion instruments all spread across the back of the orchestra, and there's perhaps usually just 1 or 2 people sort of dashing hither and thither between the various instruments that are required. And I do feel that they have so many different jobs to do. You know, the rest of the orchestra are all sitting comfortably and playing their one part, difficult as that may be, whereas the poor percussionist is dashing to and fro from various different instruments. And so they'll be dealing perhaps with a glockenspiel, reading treble and bass, and then they'll have a timp, which will be in bass, and then they'll perhaps have a gong or something like that where they have to count X bars rest and then come in at just the exact correct beat after waiting, I don't know, 27 bars rest, and then just one big crash of the cymbals, and then they're back here. And so I just feel like the percussionist has to be an absolute jack of all trades. They'll be reading percussion notation, treble clef notation, bass clef notation. It's all going on here. And so I feel for the percussionist personally. I'm used to sitting here in the woodwind section, and it's worth noticing, if you can, where the various strings are. So you'll see the violins here and the violas here, and then the cellos and the double basses here, all spanning backwards. And it's really interesting to see how this big group of musicians all unify to create a complete sound. And we're going to be looking a little bit more in detail at all the individual instruments that make up this orchestra. If you have a group of just strings, we call that a string orchestra. If you have a group of just woodwind and brass, we call that a concert band. And if you just have brass alone, it's called just a brass band. But here we have everybody combined into the orchestra. Some of these, most of these, have been dealt with in grade 4. However, in grade 5, we now have some new additions which are marked in red. Most of that is going to be in the percussion section, so we're going to have a little bit of a revision session on lots of these percussion instruments. Percussion means that it's hit, something that you hit. So it could be tuned, where you can play a melody like the glockenspiel and so on, so you hit with like the beaters to create the sound on the bars, or it could be untuned, where it makes kind of just an untuned sound like a tambourine or a cymbal. So we'll be looking quite a bit at the percussion here. Interestingly, it's worth noticing that the piano is a percussion instrument because it's hammers hitting strings, albeit through a very clever mechanism using our fingers on the keys, but the piano isn't really an orchestral instrument, even though it plays in the orchestra, with an orchestra I should say. It's as a solo instrument in a concerto. It's never sort of just included within the group of the orchestra. It would always be a solo instrument as an extra. So the percussion is basically whatever is hit. Brass is kind of instruments that you blow that are made of brass, not surprisingly. Woodwind is perhaps a little bit confusing because woodwind mostly are instruments that you blow that are made of wood, but the flute and the piccolo are now silver or gold even. But originally the flute was a woodwind instrument. It was made of wood. The Baroque flute originated in a wooden version, and then it's developed into what we have here, which can be silver, it can be silver plated, it can even be gold. And of course we have the string section, which seems quite obvious because they are strings which are bowed or plucked, and the harp is part of that group, and that does form part of the orchestra. The harp is perhaps the closest to the piano in terms of having the greatest cross-section of notes spanning from way down in the bass right up into the treble. So it's got a great span, it's got a great range of notes. But that is part of the orchestra. The piano is not a string instrument, it's a percussion instrument because the hammer action hits the strings, but it's not a member of the orchestral family. And so I do recommend that you just take some time to listen to all sorts of pieces of music. We have some suggestions here that give us a taste of all the various instruments so we can hear how they work. And it really is worth spending the time. Not only is it super enjoyable, of course, but it helps to place the instruments in context rather than just being an abstract piece of information on a paper. Because if you don't play these particular instruments, you know, it's all just a bit academic, isn't it? And unless you've played in an orchestra, there's no sort of contextual setting of what these instruments are. So there are these suggestions here, and perhaps I could just suggest a few others. And so a very famous piece is Ravel's Bolero, where the same little extract of music, the same sort of motif is repeated over and over again, and it's spread between the orchestra, so each instrument takes turns upon playing the melody. Actually, speaking of Ravel's Bolero, that is another opportunity where I really do feel for the percussionist, because the repeated drum, the repeated side drum, I think it is, like a side drum or a snare drum, side drum I think, that keeps on repeating the same rhythm over and over, is played throughout the whole piece. So while all the other instruments are taking turn, the percussionist keeps this one repeated rhythm going over and over and over and over without a break. Just listen out for the poor percussionist in Ravel's Bolero. Of course, there is Peter and the Wolf. by Prokofiev, where each instrument represents a different animal. There is the usual example of illustrating the orchestra, which is the young person's guide to the orchestra. Just write that down so you can see that by Benjamin Britten. That's a good demonstration of all the different orchestral pieces. And then for perhaps some of the more unusual ones, this instrument, I've heard it pronounced celeste or celeste, or even with an E at the end, celeste or celeste, which is kind of a very tinkly sounding piano sort of instrument. And that is perhaps now most famously associated with Hedwig's theme from the Harry Potter. Ooh, Harry Potter, not multitasking well there. And then for a more sort of contemporary, unusual, experimental side of music, we have Tubular Bells, which was an album by Mike Oldfield, where he used so many different instruments, particularly the tubular bells, which are tuned percussion instruments. There are lots of tubes hanging down in different pitches, so it looks rather like the pipes on a pipe organ as they get longer and longer, as they get deeper and deeper, and you strike these with a mallet and it creates a very distinctive sound. So let's turn over and just press on to page 62, and this is really just a matter of reading through these instruments, and we'll just have a brief chat about them, and it's just learning about these instruments. So the harp we've already discussed. It's got a massive range, and it uses pedals and levers, and the strings are plucked. It's a beautiful, beautiful instrument. The piccolo is like a flute, only it's like really tiny. It uses a treble clef and it sounds an octave higher than written, and it's even higher than the flute anyway. And if you are doing piccolo practice, you put your earphones, your earbuds in just to protect your ears until you've got it right, because it's really high. It's not really a solo instrument, it just mostly occurs within an orchestral setting. The cor anglais is a little bit misleading. It's known as, that's the English horn. However, it's more closely related to the oboe. It's not a brass instrument, even though it says English horn. That's just sort of relating back to its heritage. It's more like part of the oboe family, a beautiful sounding instrument. It's a transposing instrument, and we'll be looking more at that later, which instruments play at pitch and C and which transpose. And that's the reason we have all those exercises in transposition, because we need to cater for all of these different instruments. And then we have all of these new percussion instruments, and it's really just worth taking a moment. So we've already discussed the tubular bells, and you could listen to the Mike Oldfield album for that. The xylophone, the marimba, the glockenspiel and the vibraphone are all very similar in the way that they are laid out, but they have slightly different effects because they're either wooden bars or metal bars. Some have pedals, some can add vibrato to the sound. They're all in the same sort of family. They're all struck with slightly different beaters as well to give different effects. So you can visualise those together and just be aware of these individual differences. The celesta, again, it looks like a piano, but it's kind of a very bell-like tinkly sound. It almost sounds like a glass and water, I think. And again, I've seen it pronounced, I've heard it pronounced celesta, celesta. I've seen it pronounced with an E at the end as well. But it's all very much the same thing. And then we have the untuned percussion, which kind of give us a bang and a crash appropriately. The tambourine, I think, doesn't need much explanation. Actually, we're very likely to devalue these instruments, and yet they've definitely got their place in musical history. And if you're a percussionist, there is kind of a Ferrari version of the tambourine where you can spend so much money on a really high-class tambourine, so don't underestimate these instruments at all. The castanets we're quite used to associating with flamenco dancers and Spanish dance, and you know, the skill that these are played with is quite astronomical. And then we have different sorts of gongs. We've got the tam-tam, and then we have, again, we can have the triangle, which maybe from primary school days we've learnt to maybe disregard. However, again, if you're a percussionist, you can invest so much money in really professional Ferrari versions of the triangle also. For a little bit more information, if you refer to my PDFs, if you go to sharonbill.com and go to my website, and on the grade 5 PDFs, you'll see that I've given you some information on the general range of the instruments, and then also the strings and the voice ranges that we'll be referring to. These aren't absolute kind of examples of the instruments range. It very much depends upon the skill of the performer also, but we'll really look forward to getting really to grips with all of these different orchestral instruments. I hope this is helpful to your studies. Please do like and subscribe to stay updated. If you'd like to support this channel, you can buy me a coffee, and for advert-free lessons you can become a patron. Do visit my website where you'll find many resources available to help you. Visit sharonbill.com. Thanks for watching. Bye.